The small town of Bowraville, nestled in the lush hills of New South Wales, Australia, held a dark secret. For years, it had been a place where two communities lived side by side but worlds apart. The white residents occupied the town center, while the Aboriginal families were relegated to the outskirts, in an area known as the Mission. But in the early 1990s, this uneasy coexistence was shattered by a series of events that would haunt the town for decades to come. It began on a warm September night in 1990. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the chirping of nocturnal creatures when 16-year-old Colleen Walker-Craig vanished without a trace. Colleen, a vibrant Aboriginal girl with dreams of becoming a nurse, had been at a party on the Mission. Witnesses last saw her walking down a dimly lit street, her laughter echoing in the night. But that laughter was silenced, never to be heard again. The town stirred, whispers of concern rippling through both communities. But the whispers remained just that, whispers. The police investigation was cursory at best, treating Colleen's disappearance as just another runaway Aboriginal teenager. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would grip Bowraville in its terrifying clutches. Just weeks later, on a moonless October night, 4-year-old Evelyn Greenup vanished from her grandmother's home on the Mission. Evelyn, with her curly black hair and infectious giggle, had been sleeping on the veranda with her cousins. In the morning, she was gone, leaving behind only a small bloodstain on her pillow. The Aboriginal community was gripped by fear and anguish. 2 of their children had vanished in the span of a month, yet the town and the authorities seemed indifferent to their plight. The divide between the two communities deepened, suspicion and mistrust festering like an open wound. It was in this atmosphere of tension and fear that Jay Harper arrived in Bowraville. A charming, middle-aged white man with piercing blue eyes, Harper quickly ingratiated himself with both communities. He was seen as a bridge between the divided town, often visiting the Mission and befriending the Aboriginal families. Harper's arrival coincided with a lull in the disappearances, and for a brief moment, Bowraville dared to hope that the nightmare was over. But the reprieve was short-lived. In January 1991, 16-year-old Clinton Speedy Daru went missing after a party at Harper's house. Clinton, a popular Aboriginal teenager known for his easy smile and love of football, was last seen sleeping on Harper's couch. The next morning, he was gone, leaving behind his shoes and wallet. This time, the town couldn't ignore the pattern. 3 Aboriginal children had vanished in the span of 4 months, and the community demanded action. It was at this point that Detective Sarah Collins was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving cold cases, Collins was determined to uncover the truth. As she delved into the case, she was struck by the inadequacies of the initial investigations. Crucial evidence had been overlooked, witnesses hadn't been properly interviewed, and leads had been left unexplored. Collins began to piece together a chilling picture of what had transpired in Bowraville. Her investigation led her to Jay Harper, whose charm now seemed like a sinister facade. Harper had inserted himself into the Aboriginal community, gaining their trust while harboring dark intentions. As Collins dug deeper, she uncovered a pattern of behavior that sent shivers down her spine. Harper had a history of befriending vulnerable Aboriginal families, often providing alcohol to underage teenagers. He would throw parties at his house, creating opportunities to isolate his victims. The detective's breakthrough came when Clinton Speedy Darua's body was found in bushland outside of town. The grim discovery was followed by the recovery of Evelyn Greenup's remains in a similar area. Both bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head. Colleen Walker-Craig's body was never found, but her weighted-down clothes were discovered in the Nambucca River. As the evidence mounted, Collins became convinced that Jay Harper was responsible for all 3 murders. But proving it would be another matter entirely. The case against Harper was largely circumstantial. Physical evidence was scant, and the passage of time had eroded much of what might have been found. Moreover, the initial mishandling of the investigations had left many avenues of inquiry permanently closed. Despite these challenges, Collins pressed forward, determined to bring justice to the families of Bowraville. She conducted exhaustive interviews, re-examined old evidence, and employed the latest forensic techniques. Slowly, painfully, she built a case against Harper. But the legal system proved to be as much of an obstacle as the lack of evidence. Due to the laws at the time, Harper could not be tried for all 3 murders together. Instead, separate trials were held for the murders of Clinton and Evelyn. In both cases, Harper was acquitted due to lack of evidence. The families of the victims were devastated, their pain compounded by what they saw as a failure of justice. But Collins refused to give up. She continued to work the case, convinced that Harper would eventually slip up and provide the evidence needed to convict him. Years passed, and the case of the Bowraville murders became a symbol of the broader issues of racism and injustice in Australia. The Aboriginal community, long accustomed to being overlooked and undervalued, saw in this case a reflection of their broader struggle. They rallied, demanding changes to the legal system and a recognition of the systemic biases that had allowed these crimes to go unpunished. Their persistence paid off when, in 2016, the laws were changed to allow retrials in cases where new and compelling evidence had come to light. This change offered a glimmer of hope for the families of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. Detective Collins, now nearing retirement, saw one last chance to bring Harper to justice. She reopened the case, bringing to bear all the experience and knowledge she had gained over the years. New forensic techniques allowed for a re-examination of old evidence, yielding previously undiscovered clues. Witnesses, who had been too afraid to speak out before, now came forward with crucial information. Slowly, the full picture of what had happened in Bowraville began to emerge. Harper, it turned out, had been more calculating than anyone had realized. He had carefully chosen his victims, exploiting the racial divides in the town to avoid suspicion. He had used his charm and position as a friend to the Aboriginal community to gain access to vulnerable children. And he had relied on the indifference of the wider community and the inadequacies of the justice system to escape punishment. But now, nearly 3 decades after the first disappearance, the net was finally closing in. As Collins prepared to present the new evidence to the court, seeking a retrial, the town of Bowraville held its breath. Could justice finally be served after all these years? The case had become more than just about 3 murdered children. It was about a town forced to confront its racist past, a justice system compelled to acknowledge its failings, and a community's unwavering quest for truth in the face of overwhelming odds. As the court date approached, tensions in Bowraville reached a fever pitch. The Aboriginal community, scarred by decades of injustice but bolstered by hope, rallied around the families of the victims. The white residents of the town, many of whom had come to recognize the gravity of what had happened, joined in support. J. Harper, now an old man, watched as his carefully constructed world began to crumble. The charm that had once shielded him now seemed transparent, revealing the monster beneath. As he was led into the courtroom, he was met with the steely gazes of those he had wronged. Detective Collins, her hair now streaked with gray but her determination undiminished, presented the case. She laid out the evidence meticulously, weaving together the strands of a story nearly 3 decades in the making. The court heard of Harper's calculated grooming of the community, his manipulation of vulnerable families, and the brutal efficiency with which he had committed his crimes. Forensic evidence, once overlooked, now painted a damning picture. Fibers found on Clinton's body matched those from Harper's couch. Soil samples from Evelyn's remains corresponded to areas Harper was known to frequent. And a weathered piece of clothing recovered from the Nambucca River bore traces of Colleen's DNA. But it was the testimony of witnesses that proved most damning. People who had remained silent for years, out of fear or misplaced loyalty, now stepped forward to speak their truth. They spoke of Harper's predatory behavior, his late-night wanderings, and the fear he instilled in the community. As the trial progressed, Harper's facade of innocence began to crack. The confident smirk he had worn for years gave way to a look of desperation. In a dramatic turn of events, he finally broke down under cross-examination. In a moment of rage and frustration, Harper inadvertently revealed details about the crimes that only the killer could have known. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of his implicit confession settled over everyone present. For the families of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton, it was a moment of bittersweet vindication. The monster who had haunted their lives for so long had finally been unmasked. As the jury retired to consider their verdict, Bowraville held its collective breath. The wait seemed interminable, each hour stretching into an eternity of anxiety and hope. When the jury finally returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The foreman stood, her voice unwavering as she delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by muffled sobs and whispered prayers of thanks. Jay Harper, the man who had terrorized Bowraville for so long, was led away in handcuffs, his reign of terror finally at an end. For Detective Sarah Collins, the verdict brought a sense of closure to a case that had defined her career. But she knew that the wounds inflicted on Bowraville would take much longer to heal. In the aftermath of the trial, Bowraville began the long process of reconciliation and healing. The case had forced the town to confront its darkest aspects: the racial divisions, the systemic injustices, the collective failure to protect its most vulnerable. But it had also revealed the strength and resilience of a community that refused to let the truth remain buried. The families of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton found some measure of peace, knowing that their loved ones had not been forgotten, and that their fight for justice had brought about real change. The Bowraville murders became a catalyst for reform in the Australian justice system, leading to changes in how crimes against Indigenous people were investigated and prosecuted. The case served as a stark reminder of the cost of indifference and the power of perseverance. As for Jay Harper, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, haunted by the lives he had destroyed, and the community he had betrayed. The trees that lined Bowraville streets still whispered with the echoes of the past, but now they also carried the promise of a more just and united future. The Bowraville murders had exposed the worst in human nature, but they had also revealed the indomitable spirit of those who refused to let evil triumph. In the end, it was the spirit, the unwavering pursuit of truth and justice, that would define Bowraville's legacy. Not as the town where 3 children were silenced, but as the community that found its voice, and used it to demand a better world for all its children.